Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Winning Mentality podcast. The word legend is overused in sports and life, but my guest today fully deserves a title. Over the course of covering 45 Tour de France and 16 Olympic Games, he's become more than a cycling commentator. He is universally known as the voice of cycling. The great irony of all this is that the man himself, Phil Liggett, never planned any of it. He's never applied for a single job to this day and only got into journalism when he realised that he'd never be good enough as a professional cyclist to beat the great Eddie Merckx. As you'll hear though, he has since beaten Eddie on a bike on one occasion. Phil and I chatted about his career, how he discovered cycling in his teens as a means to explore the nearby Welsh countryside, the cyclists he's watched, and how he brings the Tour de France to people's living rooms. When we spoke, he was in Melbourne, Australia, and so the conversation took place over the internet and not face-to-face. Apologies for the occasional blip in the audio quality. All the other interviews we'll be bringing you will be done face-to-face, but our budget doesn't quite stretch to flights to Australia just yet, and hey, when you get the chance to interview Phil Liggett, you just say yes. So, without further ado, here is one of the world's best and best-known sports broadcasters. Phil, welcome to the Winning Mentality. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Charlie. It's nice to speak to you as a man of my profession.
When I first emailed you, you were in South Africa heading to the UK. You're now in Melbourne. It seems like you keep a frantic schedule.
Yeah, I fly on average 125, 130,000 miles a year. And because most of my work, funnily enough, is not in Britain anymore. I virtually don't work at all in Britain now. I work for all the Australian TV networks, African networks, and whatever comes my way, because I do a lot of work in Europe, like the Tour of Croatia, for example. And my main way of living these days is working for NBC television, which I've done for some years. In fact, they've offered me a lifetime contract, but I'll have to think about that.
What does an average year look like for you if you do sign this lifetime contract?
The work is always pretty consistent. I follow the cycling season. There are occasionally other sports come along. Not so much now, but I used to do all of the Ironman triathlons around the world. And in days gone by, I used to do the mountain bike championships, etc. And every Winter Olympics, I usually get roped into alpine skiing or ski jumping for Australian networks. But I've managed to sidestep the trip to Korea this year, and for no reason other than time. Because normally the busiest time away from the UK is between October, when we fly to our house in the bush, just on the edges of the Kruger National Park, and we go from there. We stay there, but we become totally embroiled in saving the rhinos from the poachers, so that's become a really heavy job. And you can check out on that by going to helpingrhinos.org, and that's our website. And then once we get back from Africa, we go in October, we come back just before Christmas, purely to pay the bills, to pay my taxes, and to close my company accounts. And then we go straight out to Australia. So we're only home literally for 5 working days and the 5 days around Christmas. Then 29th, 30th of December, we fly here to Australia, where I do what they call the Summer of Cycling. And so we start on the 1st of January with a series around Port Phillip Bay in Melbourne. Then we go from there, we go across to the National Championships in Ballarat, which is about 100 kilometres away from Melbourne. Then we fly down to South Australia, to Adelaide, for the Tour Down Under, which is a major race, this year celebrating 20 years. And all the best riders in the world take part. And then I come back to Victoria to do the Cadel Evans race. He was the only Australian ever to win the Tour de France and the World Professional Championship. So they made a race in his name, and I work on that for TV. And then we go and do another race called the Sun Tour, which is on TV. And then that takes me to the first week of February, and I fly back to the UK for 10 more days. Bearing in mind, I've only had 10 days there since last October, and I have another 10. And then we go across back to the house in Africa. When I finally return, it's for Paris-Roubaix, the French Classic, about the 7th or 8th of April. Then I roll on. I do the Tour of Croatia, the Tour of California for NBC, and and it's the Tour de France knocking on your door. And then whatever else comes along. I mean, this is my 5th visit to Australia because we flew out here at the end of last year. So I've flown into Australia 5 times last year, mainly for corporate dinners and speeches, and but also to work on TV. So yeah, I just fly in circles really. But the world, unfortunately, is a big circle.
And you've been doing it a long time.
I have.
Is it 1973 your first Tour de France?
It was indeed 73. I was a driver come journalist at the time. I did that, and that's the way it stayed for 5 years. And then the guy who'd introduced me to the Tour de France, who became a very close friend, David Saunders, his name was, he got killed in a car crash in 1978 in March. And the television knew of me then, and so they said he would love you if you give a shot at his job. And so there was no interviews. I took the job as a commentator in April 78, did a live TV show. I thought I was rubbish, but they thought I was okay. And I've been working ever since in television. And to this very day, most incredibly lucky person, I've never actually applied for a job in television. Every network in the world has always called me. And it sounds very conceited, but I'm a very laid-back guy, basically. And they heard me, said, hey, come and work for us, and that's how it's worked out. So I work for all the American networks, etc.
So there was no training?
No.
No journalism school?
I get these young journalists. Of course, in 78, there was no journalism school at all, full stop. And so all these young kids coming up to the A-levels, etc., want to know how I got the job, how can they do it, how can they study. And I really couldn't help them because I was lucky enough to apply and get a job as a journalist in Fleet Street on the basis of a few articles I'd written in the local newspaper on Merseyside. And then they trained me. I went to journalism school 1 day a week, day release, I think they called it in those days. But now, of course, if you haven't got a university degree in something in journalism, you won't get in the jobs. But no, I've been very lucky. I've had no training at all.
Do you think that, I mean, you're one of the world's leading sports broadcasters, but do you think that feeling that you're very lucky to be there is one of the reasons you just keep going for so long and you still love it so much?
Yeah, I love it. I keep going for so long because I really do love it. To me, it's never been a job. It's just being an observer of how the world in sport progresses, and you try and read those pictures and pass them back to the people you know are viewing. When I commentate on a cycle race, don't forget, in my early days, cycling was they called it a Cinderella sport, but in most people's eyes, outside of a cyclist, it didn't exist. They just thought you're a crackpot. And at the end of the day, all I was doing was building what was a hobby into a profession. And, I make no bones about it. I've probably been one of the highest paid commentators in the world. And then it's all come through the silly sport of cycling in most people's eyes. Nowadays, it has a different aspect. Nowadays, of course, cycling is a major sport. Okay, we keep shaking off the drug scandals. And the amazing thing is that cycling is not the biggest drug sport in the world, but dope peddlers somehow has a better ring than a dope soccer player. No, I've enjoyed telling people, and my biggest, if I've done anything, I've progressed the sport and the pastime through passion to get people who were not interested in cycling into the sport and the pastime, either to participate, because cycling now is extremely popular as a means of transport, or indeed to commentate and enjoy the sport itself by introducing to the characters in the play.
Where did you first get interested in it? I mean, if it was, as you say, it was a very obscure sport back in the late 60s and early 70s. Where did your interest come from? Tom Simpson was the first British rider to win the yellow jersey in the Tour de France. We did it in 1962 down in Luchon. And I remember my best mate, who lived 2 doors away on the Wirral, he'd taken up cycling, so he popped over to Europe for a bike ride. He was a hopeless cyclist, but he just used his bike as a great means of transport. And he said, there's some guy down here. He said, he's just pulled on the yellow jersey in the Tour de France. Well, of course, I knew it was in 62, but it didn't make hardly in one line on the television. And he died in the Tour de France in 67. That did make a headline on the 9 o'clock news of Tommy Simpson. But yeah, I started cycling purely to go fishing.
And my mate Robin, and this is the guy I'm talking about, he now lives in Canada, has done for 30, 40 years, still rides his bike, but and still very badly.
Is he getting any better?
No, he'll never improve, Robin, because his bike was a means of getting him over the hill to go and see what Wales looked like. He wasn't particularly worried about the ride to get there. He wanted to see the other side of the mountains. Whereas in my case, I suddenly started going out. He persuaded me to go cycling, and I resisted for a long time because Sunday was the only day of the week I got a decent meal at Sunday lunch with Mum, and I wasn't going to get it now because I was on the bike. In the end, I cracked and I went out and I loved it. And it took me less than 2 years. That was about 1959. I didn't start cycling until I was 15. And then in less than 2 years, I just had to be like these racing cyclists I kept seeing. And I joined a racing club, and it happened to be a very good racing club. And they were good to me and they helped me. And it was something I could do. I couldn't swim. I couldn't play football. I couldn't play any sport. I couldn't play rugby. They threw me into touch. And so by the end of that time, I just wanted to see how good I was. So I got a job as an accountant. Again, I was asked to do the job. A guy I trained when I worked at Port Sunlight. He said, I'm not working here for long. He said, I'm going to be the general manager of this company, and I want you to come and work for us. And I did. And I was very valuable to learn accountancy. They took me to school for exams and stuff. And then I became assistant to the accountant, and the accountant called me into the office. He said, hey, look, he said, you're not going to be a happy man, are you, until you find out just how good you are on the bike. I said, no, you're right. So he said, take a year out and do your thing and come back in 1 year's time, and your job will be here. And I just said to the accountant, I said, well, I really appreciate it. I said, but I'm not the sort of guy who ever comes back. So I said, I'll always come back and say hi, but I won't come back for the job. And that was how we left it, and that's how I progressed. I went to live in Belgium. I earned a pro contract, and at the same time I was writing just this local paper. Then I was reporting the races for the British papers in Ghent. I lived in Belgium. And then that paper I was reporting was based in Fleet Street. And they said, hey, there's a job going, apply. I said, well, I don't really want the job. I've got a pro contract back here next year. And they said, it's up to you. So I did apply, and I didn't get the job. But the guy who did lasted, I think it was 4 weeks, and he just walked out. And so the editor rang me. He said, it's Friday lunchtime, and it was a winter time, and I was working in Lever Brothers, carrying milk churns to strengthen my back. He said, it's if you're here Monday morning, 8 o'clock, at your desk in Fleet Street, you've got the job. There's no more interviews. And this was Friday lunchtime. London to me and my parents, it could have been Timbuktu. We don't go to London in those days. So I went home and told my mum, tears all round. I drove overnight and slept in the car. It's a long way to London in those days, no motorways. And I was at the desk at 8 o'clock in Fleet Street. And that was the start of my life changing.
And I heard a rumour, you might tell me this isn't true, that when you were riding and combining it with some writing, that you were encouraged to join breakaway groups because people knew you'd write the story well. It
is true. First of all, when I got to the magazine, the editor called me over to chat. And he said, that's your desk over there. He says, and by the way, your cycling's finished now. You can't ride your bike anymore. I said, I thought, yeah, right, okay. But I thought, well, I'm not going to tell him. I'll just keep riding my bike. And I entered a couple of races, and I was doing quite well in the races, but I was never late for work. And then after about, I can't tell you the length of time, but during that cycling season of 67, which is when I went down there, he called me over again. He said, look, he said, I know you're racing. He says, I'm getting lots of good letters coming in saying at last the magazines have got a real good cyclist who knows what he's talking about as well. So he said, all I'm going to say to you, if you're late for any of the print schedules, I'll sack you. Otherwise, carry on racing. And he did, and that's what I did. He was a genuine friend, the editor was. He sadly died in cancer some years ago. Genuine friend, but he would have sacked me, no question whatsoever. The paper was first and paramount. And so I appreciated that. So I kept racing, but what happened over the next 2 years was I was racing There was only one parking space free in Fleet Street for a car. So I was in Fleet Street by 6 a.m. in the morning. I got the space. Bike was in the back, and I always raced South London, and I lived North London because I had a sponsor from the South. And so I rode well in these races. I raced every Tuesday night, Thursday night, and I had track racing on other nights, much nearer home. And at weekends, the rule that Alan made, he was the editor, Alan said, you can only ride the best races. Otherwise, there's no point in you reporting them. We're not going to print them. And so what happened was I rode all the best races. But the best races could have been right up in Newcastle. It could be anywhere. And I'd drive to these races, ride the darn things, and then have to get back to be on time for the Sunday night press deadline. And often slept on the mailbags through the night. So when I was in the races, and I did get in the breakaways occasionally, but I wasn't doing the training of these bloody top stars. Sometimes my old mates from Liverpool used to always ride these races because they're the best. And if guys ever started getting on to me, saying, just get off the front and back of there and do some work up here, my mate would always say, his name was Pete Matthews, my mate would always say, just leave him alone. He's got his typewriter in his back pocket and he's going to write about the race, so he's all right there. I'd be at break of 6 and I couldn't work with them. These guys are racing for England and I couldn't keep up. I just hung in there.
But one thing that's apparent, listening to that and listening to your schedule now, is you absolutely love the sport. Can you put your finger on what it is about cycling?
Very difficult. First of all, it's purely a means of transport because no car in the family. And I paid off my bike over 2 years at 1 and 9pence a week. The very first bike I got was a Rally Linton, and it was heavy, steel. And I used it to go fishing. And then I got another bike in the mail order from London called the Freddie Grubb. And I actually started riding that with the club. And then we used to go on weekends, youth hosteling, and then I've discovered Wales, north coast of Wales, down to the West Wales to Harlock, and it was a way of life now, and it was in the blood, and I trained pretty hard as well. I never dreamt of driving a car. I didn't need to. I could get anywhere by bike given the time. And my life unfolded like that, and then a passion, which is, in those days, I was purely a cyclist doing it for myself, making a lot of friends. But even while I've been here in Australia, and they said it again, like they've said it many times when I've met people around the world, once you've caught sort of cycling fever, the people you meet are all genuine people. I was with a hotel manager of a hotel in Cape Town about 4 years ago, I suppose. And he put me up in the hotel. He wasn't charging me because I was with an organisation. And he said, I'm going for a ride, Phil. I said, what, you're riding a bike? Can't give it up, he said. Ever since the cyclists started staying in the hotel, he said, it's unbelievable. They've got a fabulous bike. He said, I go riding with them. They're also friendly. They're all talking to me. They've all got stories to tell. He says, I'm totally addicted. I'll never, ever not ride my bike again. He changed his body shape in those 2 years from a rotund man to a slim-lined athlete. And we, in fact, Trish and I stayed in his hotel just before we flew back at Christmas time on the 18th of October. And I didn't see him, but he left a nice bottle of wine in my room and he gave me a sweet. So that's a nice gesture, you know. They talk about all the people who ride the Tour de France and report the Tour de France. You can't stop doing it because you get Tour fever. And you're part of it now. It is in your blood. Everybody counts the days to doing the next one.
Feel free to say it's your influence, but what do you think it is that keeps the public coming back for more? Because I can see from your point of view, you've got this massive excitement of being on the Tour, but I mean, the Tour now, it's one of the biggest sports events in the world. It
is indeed. I mean, when I was 17 and standing in the club room of the New Brighton Cycling Club and not knowing anybody, I remember this girl coming over to me and I was talking to her and a group of guys asked me what I did. And at that time, I was just starting out in the offices at Port Sunlight. And I got talking to them and certainly wasn't an experienced cyclist. I've only been riding a bike less than 2 years. And I told them stories and stuff. And she said, you should write a book. She said, you're fascinating to listen to. And I just do it. I never think about it. And to this day, people still say the same things. I just tell stories But I can tell a story. And the reason my stories are good is because in my mind, I'm seeing the pictures of that story. Everything I'm saying, I can see vividly. For example, I can see the guy, if I'm saying he's picking his nose, I can see him picking his nose. And by saying it like that, I guess the television's the same. When I used to do, in my early days, voiceovers for American television, they're very difficult to do because you must write a word-by-word script. So they give you a tape, say it's 5 minutes long, and you've got to make your words hit it right. No, your word must hit the television at the same time his fist hits the guy's face. And so they're very difficult to write and be accurate. You learn how to keep your words brevity rather than levity. And so I learned a lot from American TV. But when I looked at those pictures, I looked at them as a guy who'd never ridden Paris-Roubaix, for example. And I already was a journalist, and I've been trained as a journalist. So I just looked at the pictures and I wrote what I saw. What I saw was a guy with his rib cage rattling on a cobblestone of hell, and I used to call it the roller coaster of hell and things like that. Americans loved it because I wasn't describing, well, this guy's got, he's 36 years old, he's been cycling for 14 years, and now he's finally going to win his first Paris-Roubaix, because they don't understand what the Paris-Roubaix is. You've got to explain it very, very carefully. American training is very basic because the American producers always tell me, nah, the Americans know nothing. You've got to tell them everything. And so if you can always tell a journalist and commentator who's been trained in America because they're very, very ABC. Honestly, I sound very egotistical, but I get stopped, as Trish will vouch for you, every minute of my life outside the hotel room. You'd think I was a bloody pop star, which I'm not. But people stop me and give me their life stories. There was a guy, sadly, this kid got killed just before Christmas. He was 23. And I met the father 3 days ago. And I rode this memorial ride for Jason, the kid. And he said, do you remember Jason? I said, yeah, of course I remember. He said, well, do you remember when you first met him? I said, not really. He said he was 11 years old. He said all he wanted was you to say his name. And you said to him he'd be a good rider one day. And he filled up. And those are the stories. I don't particularly like that particular story, but people say that to me every day of my life. They remember what they were doing. It's like the death of John Kennedy. You know where you were sat the day he died. You won't, but I did. He died in 1963. I was sat in a pub in Lord Levy Hume's place in Port Sunlight. And people remember things like that. They base your life on it. And every day they come over and tell me the stories. And I listen to them because they're rather good stories. But that's important.
It just goes to show, doesn't it? If you talk about anything with passion, it's engaging.
It is, absolutely right. And I listen to the commentators, and they come up and ask me for tips. Well, I can't give many tips. It's like a great cyclist can't tell me why they're so great. Eddie Merckx can't tell me how to win a Tour de France. He just goes out and does it. David Beckham, the same in football. They can't tell you how they do it because the best coaches in the world have never actually made the top. They've only worked hard to nearly make the top. Those guys can tell new people how to work hard to make the top. But the top guys don't know. And I go and put headsets on and I look at the television screen and I'll see something there that nobody else sees. But I can't tell you how I see it because I don't know. I'll just call it. And I knew that people watching the Tour de France in the world, we get 150 million viewers on the tour around the world. And I know that they're not interested in the Tour de France as a bicycle race because there's probably 300,000 cyclists watching. That's all. The rest are all not cycling people. So they need to know about the history of France and the height of the Tourmalet and when the snow falls and when a vulture, which was introduced into the Alps, Pyrenees 20 years ago, and now it's just terrific stories. They need to know when a kite goes past or a chateau. And that's what they love. And I get mail after mail saying, look, I'm not really a cyclist, but boy, what a lovely town that was they went to yesterday. Can't wait for tomorrow when we get in the Alps. And those are the people watching the Tour de France. Then they develop a feeling for the bike riders. Then the bike riders, they are like a soap.
Yeah, I've heard you say before that all of the cyclists have their own soul and personality, and you're telling the story.
Yeah, because they get knocked around and they get up and ride again. But more importantly, if they're young pros going to the tour, I mean, I remember a guy called Simon Gerrans, he's an Aussie, and Phil Anderson was not the first Australian, but the very, very first really great Australian to ride the tour in the 80s. He wore the yellow jersey for about 14 days in all. And so he lived through an era when nobody knew Phil. He never won a race in his own country, no, because he lived in Europe all the time. A sportsman that should have been honoured beyond belief by his own country for what he did. I saw him this weekend playing as well. Anyway, so Phil comes off and then he says, I've got this kid, he says, his name's Simon Gerrans. He used to do a lot of motocross on a motorbike and he was very good, but he crashed and hurt his knee. So they rebuilt his knee and he took up cycling and he got to like cycling better. And this kid's been 3 times the Aussie champion. He's ridden in the Tour de France. He's won the biggest race in the world, Milan-San Remo, Liège-Bastogne, since. But work hard. He's such a fantastic example of how to get the best out of your body in the sport. So I used to use him as an example because Phil used to say he was helping him. And Phil reminded me of the day he got to the Tour de France. And Simon's he's a little lad and he's still a sort of baby-faced kid, but he's a brilliant bike rider. And Simon rang Phil. He said, Phil, I'm looking out of my window at the Alps. What do I do? He said, mate, you just bloody suffer and you'll get over the other side. And that was the only advice Phil could give him.
Well, it's interesting, actually. You've mentioned quite a few of the top cyclists. Do you think that there's a characteristic that unites these people? Do you think that are they ultimately quite similar people?
Well, they've all got the same. They all find and seek friendship. The guy who won the championship yesterday, a guy called Alex Edmondson, he came to the finish with his best mate. Absolutely, the way the race panned out. A guy called Chris Harper, and he said it was horrible. He said I had to beat my best mate to win the title, but his best mate hung on for third. So there you go. But when they finished that ride, they were the best of friends again. They didn't fall out and punch each other up or anything like that. Job done. Now let's get on to drinking coffee together and going out training together. And that's what they do. And that's a common thing in cycling. The best pros in the world, I'm often told this by journalists, when journalists go to interview cyclists, they're available. They want 50 quid appearance fee. But you go to a football player, you won't get through his agents to even get to the player, the story. Cyclists don't need to bother. You want to see me, I'll walk over. I've taken so many famous cyclists across to meet people. Chris Hoy in Manchester at the World Championship some years ago, I was working for an Australian company, BHP Billiton, and they were making the medals for Beijing, and they were indoctrinating all the VIPs. So they asked me if I'd take the VIPs from Australia up by train to Manchester and take them to the World Championships, which I did. They had a centre table in the arena. And of course, they wanted to meet the riders. Well, that's not so easy at the World Championships because they're very tense around the track circle. I went up to Chris. I said, Chris, why don't you come and meet the people that are making all the gold medals you're going to win in Beijing next year? Sure, he said. He came over. He was absolutely brilliant. Sat down. They told them how they were making these medals because they own all the mines and how they were blending these gold medals together. And Chris did actually win 3. So.
Yeah.
But Chris was not at all saying, I can't do it now. I'm riding a world championship in an hour. He just said, yeah, I'll be over there. Just give me 1 minute. He walked over, shook hands with everybody, made them feel as though he had all night with them, goes back, gets on his bike and rides the world. Unbelievable.
They just have that ability to turn it on and then be a different person.
I think it's because cycling is probably one of the hardest sports physically. You look at talented riders, don't think they win because, yes, they've got the talent to be in a position to win, but don't think they don't hurt like everybody else from the guys finishing last upwards, because they do. They have to conquer that as well as turn out the numbers to make the job done. And that makes them a very humble person, I think. Everybody feels for them when they can really hurt themselves like that. I won a lot of races, not so many, but I could suffer. So the Belgians have this wonderful saying, if you can suffer 10 minutes longer than the guy alongside you, you'll win. You try suffering when you're on the rivet for 10 minutes. That's like 20 years. It is just unbearable. And with about 5 miles to go, they'll probably say to themselves, this is the last time I'll ever do this again. But the brain is wonderful. Within 30 seconds of getting off the bike, it's forgotten the pain. And so you're ready to start again in 2 days.
Well, thinking about all those winners, I'm just interested, is there anyone who stands out? One person that you just think mentally more than anything was just invincible?
Well, it was Eddie Merckx, the Belgian cyclist. He rode 1,500 professional races. He won 525. That's 1/3 of his races he won. Take seconds and thirds, which were numerous. He didn't lose many races off the podium. This guy was exceptional. And I raced against him in 1966 when he was an amateur. He was a world champion by 18 as well. And I couldn't get near him. And that was the one reason that when I got the job up to go to Fleet Street and be a journalist, and I looked at the pro contract, and I thought, I'll never beat Eddie Merckx. And he's going to be at the pro next year, same year as me, and I can't do it. So and I've told Eddie this story many, many years later. I interviewed him in Brussels at his home, and I told him the story. And he laughs because he said, you beat me. That's pas possible. And he just jokes with me. And we're very good friends. We're really good friends now. But the guy I interviewed him on stage in Adelaide, I guess it was 4 or 5 years ago. Very difficult interview subject, Eddie, because he doesn't speak very, very good English, but he speaks it good enough. But he can't really express himself. And he did say to me, he said, let's talk in French, Phil, because I don't speak English so good. I said, Eddie is bloody perfect. And I spoke to him for, I guess, 45 minutes. And he got a standing ovation. We had 2,000 people in the auditorium. It was a big dinner. And when we settled back to the tables, I went over to him and I said, Eddie, you were absolutely fantastic tonight. And he looked at me, he goes, no, Phil, you were fantastic. What he meant was I'd brought the best out of him. And that's a good interview because I got him to say what he felt. Because normally you'd say, Eddie, you don't look so good. He goes, no. Have you been ill? Yes. And he was hopeless to interview. But if you hit him on the right moment and got him into it, you could see in his mind, like in my mind, take him to a bike race he won, like the Tour de France for the first time. And you say, but what about stage 13, Eddie? That was a bad day, eh? Oh, yes, but the weather and the cold, and then we had to go down 3 mountains, and then so-and-so was coming too fast, and I saw him go off the mountain. Then he just unloaded, because you could see it happening at that very moment.
Well, I suppose when you realised you couldn't beat him on the bike, you were disappointed, but it seems to have turned out pretty well in the end.
Well, I told him that, and then we come back, we can spool forward to about 10, maybe less than 10 years ago, not much less. Eddie's now looking like a barrel. He stopped cycling. He's got every award possible in Belgium, right up to being a baron of the country. And his personal friends are the kings of Belgium. And he came over to Africa in March. And there's this big race called the Cape Town Cycle Tour. And gets 38,000 cyclists. And Eddie was a VIP in it. And I was riding. And I saw him at the function the night before. I said, how are you, Eddie? What are you doing? I said, you're riding? Yes. And I said, you're looking a bit big. I said, the good Belgian beer. Okay. And I said, where are you riding? He told me what group it was. We didn't really know. It just goes when they tell him to go. I said, I bet you 50 rand I'll do a better time. He looked at me and goes, you, better than me? I said, yes. But I'd seen how big he was. I said, yes. He said, 50 rand. Okay, it's a bet. Right. So I rode a different group, and I didn't see him again because he went back to Belgium. And 3 days later, the newspaper that's involved in the sponsorship prints everybody's name and where they rank in the result with the time. And I found mine, and then I found Eddie's, and I've beaten Eddie. I thought, Christ, he owes me 50 rand. And so for the next 2 years, I chased that 50 rand. And after 2 years, I met a guy in Johannesburg, a journalist I knew. He said, tomorrow, I'm so excited. I'm interviewing Eddie Merckx. I said, brilliant. Tell him he owes me 50 rand. And he did. And I saw this guy a week later. He said, I've got you 50 rand. I said, what? He said, Eddie, give it to me. And he said, there it is. And to this day, it's still folded up. in a plastic pouch in my office desk drawer. I opened the 50 rand and it said, double or quits, Eddie. But now, there's a whole different Eddie Merckx now. He'd had an operation to sort of tuck in his tummy, get rid of all the gut. Doesn't drink beer anymore. This guy was flying at 65 years of age. Nobody could get near him. And so I would never do it again, but I see him quite often.
I think your careers worked out just fine for both of you in the end.
Well, in the end, yes. I made the right decision, but I always say to everybody, that was the only decision I've made in my whole career, which is not to turn pro, but to be a journalist. That's the only decision. I was asked to go into radio, I was asked to go into TV, and I was asked to speak at dinners and so on.
Well, Phil, at the very start of the chat, we ascertained that you're a busy man. So, final question. Are you going to sign that lifetime contract at NBC?
Well, they flew to London, I'm not sure it was last year or the year before now. Yeah, I lost my phone on the tube going to see them, I know that. The big man. And I thought, Christ, they're going to sack me. And so I went to see him in a lunchtime in a hotel in Docklands, because he was here, because NBC have the rights to the Premiership football, big deal. And they were coming here to watch the big teams play. And so I walked in, met him. I said, how are you? He said, nice to see you. He said, sit down. So I did. He said, when are you going to retire? Just like that. I said, well, I didn't really have a plan to retire. I said, but you tell me, because you've got 2 years of me on the contract, and then I can go. Oh, no, I'm not thinking in the 2 years on the contract, he said. I'm thinking of when you want to go further on. He said, and we talked, and then he said, well, look, only once in the company's history have we ever offered a lifetime contract to a commentator, and that was to a golf guy. And he said, if you're willing to go, if you're willing to give us 1 year's notice when you want to retire, that's all we ask. Otherwise, just keep on coming. I said, well, I couldn't believe it. I said, I feel it's rather onerous to have to think that it's now down to me to say I'm giving up. I hate that. But that's how it stands at this moment. And they've offered me a lifetime contract with 1 year's notice.
Well, Phil, it's been wonderful hearing someone who's made a life out of their passion, and long may it continue.
I used to look at my very first checks on BBC Radio, £5, £10, thinking, this is unbelievable. I'm making this money talking about cycling. It's crackers. I've been very lucky.
A massive thank you to Phil for the call, and who knows, maybe I'll manage to catch him in person for another chat later in the year at one of the European races. Don't forget that you can follow Phil on Twitter at Phil Liggett, PhilLiggett, and make him a very happy man by donating to save the rhinos in South Africa. This podcast has already made a donation, so if you want to do your good deed for the day, head to helpingrhinos.org. This interview is just one part of a big project, and I can promise you now that this weekly podcast will always be free to listen to. You're never going to be charged to hear these interviews. However, if we're going to build this into something big and continue to attract top sports people to this podcast, we need your help. Big numbers of listeners and positive reviews help give the podcast credibility and make it appealing for guests to come on. So subscribe, share, comment, tell your friends about what we're doing, and help spread the word. The more listeners and subscribers we have, the more guests will want to appear on the show, and the more interviews we can produce for you. We love sport and the stories behind it, and we know you do too. So help us build this, and we promise you a weekly dose of high quality sporting conversation in return. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.